But if I purely if I take off my Mila Trustee hat and pop on my parenting hat, I'd say, what a dreadful, dreadful shame that they didn't seize the opportunity to reimagine the relationship between schools and parents, and that opportunity to make this a collaborative effort. And perhaps we'll come on to the digitisation of education next. But those are my initial thoughts.
Thank you, and I love your reimagining of that relationship between the parent and the state. I think that's a really important challenge. I'm going to come now to Peter first. Your reflections on the curriculum, like just putting that hat back on. How are you feeling about the outcome?
I mean, what's interesting in a review like this is it's a large document, and you tend to pick out the things that you're looking for. So I've partly with a different hat on. I as Hannah said, set up a charity, Voice 21, which has been promoting oracy, and oracy is a big thing, and it's sort of mentioned in the. So we're very, very pleased with the mentions and the fact that there's going to be a framework on oracy. And it links to what we've been talking about talking in schools and actually having space. The oracy has multi-dimensions. It's about classroom learning and knowledge, as many of you will know, and how you deepen thinking in the classroom, but it's also about having rich discussions, and a number of you will know things like philosophy for children, which are techniques for how you tackle moral issues in a scaffolded way. So it has multi-dimensions. So, I'm pleased with things like that. I think overall it is very, very disappointing that you've got a real opportunity to have a new vision and a new purpose for education and go back to first principles. There's not even an attempt to do that. So it's a totally vision-free document. There's 150 there's 150 pages of minor tweaks to the geography curriculum in secondary school, which, and history was my subject. I literally couldn't fathom most of them. They were the most minute things. So it is it's a very feeble document, basically. But the question now, because that was the review, is what the government does next. It's got a white paper coming up. There's opportunities to be more radical, opportunities to do, as you say, on parents or a whole range of things. But look, final sentence on it. I mean, we're in a world that we've all said is completely different, even than when this previous curriculum was done a few years ago. And it can't be beyond us to think we're now in a we've got to rethink what school is about, and sort of AI is one obvious other thing where we've got to spend the time to think what's the purpose of school and how do we prepare people for the world, because school doesn't do that. It prepares people for the 1950s, prepares people for the world that they're going to go into.
Not on this one. So we'll return now. Thank you. I think just such a different, but in many ways consistent, perhaps, feeling that we should be thinking bigger. We should be thinking about a greater vision for our future. I think I'm just going to return us to the role of teachers, because I think the insight from the beginning was this concern about a cancel culture in classrooms and a real difficulty for teachers to be navigating what is an incredibly polarised context in the outside world, but also really complicated online world. And recognising that this curriculum may not have, the curriculum review may not have taken us as far as we would have liked. There is still a significant step change in the inclusion of citizenship and also media literacy. So I'm curious, and also we've heard that there is no money for teacher training with this new curriculum from the DFE. So what changes would you ideally be liking to see to support teachers, or the role that teachers could be taking on in this new world of 2028, when this intervention may be coming in, or even now? Shoaib, do you want to take that one? What should we be seeing from our teachers, and what do they need?
I mean, just to give you like a small anecdote, to be very clear, I'm not a teacher. I'm not a teacher trainee. I work with young people, but not in that context. So that's a big caveat. But I think back to my experience when I was growing up, and I was incredibly lucky. I went to a state school, but I studied A-level politics in a very small class of 15 students. And I remember during that 2-year period, my opinions changed so much because of the two teachers that I had and the conversations that we had. And I centred, I don't tell you from which side, but I centred my opinions a lot more and was able to understand a lot more nuance. And the reason for that was because I had two teachers who had very clear opinions. One was literally a former military guy, and the other person was pro-Scottish independence. So that was the two vibes, but they tried their best. They tried their best not to give us their political opinions, but we had a lot of discussions and a lot of arguments. and it got quite heated, and there was a lot of circumstances where we shouted at each other, but we came together, and that space was given to us. Comparatively, when we were at schools, it was kind of shocking to see how surprised teachers were to hear the opinions of the young people that they've been working with for so long. I mean, there was one school where we were having quite a difficult conversation, and there was the two assistant principals who had been super excited to see Peter because he's kind of a celebrity. Didn't give a shit about me. But the two assistant principals were at the back of the classroom, and they looked devastated at the conversations that we were having. So I went to the back thinking we're going to get reported. So I was like, whispered in their ears, this event's incredible. Like, and they looked at me like, really? They're doing well? I'm like, yeah, best school we've ever had. But it was almost as if they couldn't believe that specific student said that specific thing. And the reason they couldn't believe it is because they've not had them spaces for conversations yet. So in terms of what skills can you give young teachers, I've got a lot of teachers that are friends of mine, and they talk about the fact that they're not incentivized to have those conversations. They're incentivized not to. The system, not just for the protection of themselves, but also the protection of the young people that they work with. Because if there is a young person that missteps, there's a lot of things and parameters that have been put in place over the last 15 years where you have to report that young person, and they don't want to do that. And at the same time, they might be recorded, they might be put on TikTok, and that's literally happening. There's so many videos of teachers that are being recorded saying inappropriate things. So it's tough, but yeah.
Go, Peter.
Yeah, I haven't got a lot to add to that other than, I mean, putting myself in the shoes of teachers is you need confidence to have these discussions and make them very open-ended. You could have very closed discussions, but if you're talking about, you know, that group of girls that I was facilitating and was talking about dick pics and all the rest of it, it was easier for us because we're coming into the school. If you're a regular teacher, you then think, well, do I need to report that immediately, or have we done enough? It becomes a sort of can of worms. I mean, rightly, because it's a serious thing that's happened. But I think that is the worry, that you're just opening up grief for yourself as a teacher, and it would be better to shut it down. So I think we've got to train teachers. We've got to, from the head teacher down, you've got to be facilitating these spaces, and think that is one of the jobs of school, is to have these places where people can talk very openly about it.
Thank you. I'm going to come to Julian next, because I know you train teachers, you think about the needs of teachers and environments. What do you think teachers need now?
So it's like
It's weird, isn't it?
it's like rapping to the Beastie Boys in my bedroom. But Paul's Boutique, not licensed to ill, just to be clear. So it's a bit of a shopping list, this, but I think it's important. And I'm going to say I think we in the room know what works, and what works is expensive and does take time. So I think if we set out this shopping list, then we can come back from it in terms of what's possible in the current climate. So there is a list of what works from research. Ofcom have commissioned work on what works in teacher training for media literacy quite recently as well. And we know the thing that works the best is co-design between teachers and students. We know that these third spaces again work very well. We know that it's important to adapt media literacy pedagogy to context, so community. We also know, of course, that there are limits on what can be achieved, because what happens at home is really important as well. So understanding the media life experiences young people are having at home, and being able to have trust and rapport with teachers to negotiate that. It's time consuming and difficult pedagogically, but of course teachers are the best people to do that work. We also know that there's a great piece of research by Jennifer Rousel, where she talks about digital amphibians. So, you know, we've had this kind of myth for years about digital natives, which talks about digital amphibians, and how we're all kind of negotiating transitions all the time between different kinds of tech experiences, and young people are no different. So if teachers are able to work with young people and see media literacy as a collective endeavour, our media literacy, how are we going to negotiate the conditions of possibility of working with media and tech in our everyday lives? And already you can see how difficult this is as I'm describing it. We know that librarians are very important. We know that teachers working in collaboration with librarians works very well. And we also know that media literacy is not a solution. And it might sound counterproductive to be saying that as the chair of trustees of the Media and Information Literacy Alliance, but it's the uses of your media literacy in context for positive social change. So if you can have a curriculum intervention which is not about equipping people with media literacy like a kind of deficit model, binary thing, but how are people going to use their media literacy to make the communication ecosystem healthier, then that's difficult, but more productive if we can do that.
Just a couple of kind of, I suppose, they're slightly peripheral examples of the stuff that we hear. One is, dare I mention, the phone bans in school. And one of the more depressing things that we've heard recently is a teacher who said that they'd seen a 97% drop in reports of incidents in their school having banned phones, which, to that point about how are we opening up conversations, how are we facilitating help-seeking behaviour, actually, I do worry that's one example where there's an unintended consequence of a policy direction of travel that kind of runs counter to that third space, open conversations, being on the journey with young people towards using tech responsibly. And the other QI, I think it's QI, is that we're also hearing from teachers who say there's a fantastic moment when AI briefly made our workload dip. And then parents discovered AI, and we're now seeing parents who wouldn't
Yeah, I know.
previously have written in to complain using ChatGPT to write their complaint letter to school, and so that's shot up. So, I think in all of this we have to bear in mind teachers are busy, and these tools and the policies don't always have the consequence that we are anticipating.
I do want to bring us on to AI because I think its situation in the new curriculum within computing and not necessarily within citizenship, I think is an interesting one for us to reflect on. But just staying with the smartphone ban, because I do think it's interesting that given that media literacy has been positioned within citizenship, it's been seen as like a positive set of skills to enable participation in the modern media environment, in the modern political environment. Do we see a contradiction then with these ideas about smartphone bans, smartphone access in schools? And I'm curious as to the panel's view on that. Should schools be approaching the use of smartphones in school differently? Should parents be thinking about access to smartphones differently if we're providing these skills at a younger age? Shoaib, do you have a view on that?
Yeah, I think there's 2 points. On the AI point, like I thought it was, again, I'm not an expert in this area, I'm not going to stop saying that now, but I'm not an expert on the specific area around schooling in particular in the curriculum. But it does make sense to me that like AI has been split into computing. I think there's a place for both sides of it because there's two, in my head, AI is used in two very different ways. I've got AI that I use in my work. My boss is here. I don't use it to do that kind of work, but just help me with emails and scheduling. And that feels like a work-related thing where it's a computing, it's a skill that I need to hone and get better at. At the same time, I come across AI a lot online and I see a lot of videos on social media that are really dangerous and I think to myself, and I question whether a video is, it was generated by AI or it wasn't. And I've got my 16-year-old brother is better at telling me if a video was created by AI or if it wasn't created by AI, which is insane. On the question around school phones bans, we went into this and we both kind of, I think it's fair to say that we both didn't think that we were pro social media bans, and we came out of it having just spoken to young people. And when I have children, not anytime soon, but when I have children, I think I would not let them on social media under the age of 16, but I would allow them to have a phone because I think there's two very different things. I think we as like adults and government and policymakers need to make sure that algorithms are not targeting young people in a negative way, but they live on their phones and they've come accustomed to it. And by taking it away, you're taking away so much of their identity. However, there are ways that you can counteract that, right? Like, and I think it's the really sad thing is the more education you have around it, the more likely you are to limit your child's use of their phone. But the parents from underprivileged backgrounds who might not have the time and the access and the resources to understand the damage that it's having on their children will not understand it and not be able to navigate it. So I think it's a really complicated question that I've not delved into in a lot of detail, but maybe Peter will have a bit of a better answer.
No, but so what I've always thought, I'm slightly changing my mind on some of it, but we've got to be sort of clear-headed on what the main problems are. So as a head teacher, all the problems I faced with online bullying or whatever it was, there weren't huge numbers, but it was between 4 and 11 o'clock at night after school, because then young people are, at home often with a parent working, so they're on their own at home. They're also more bored, they're less occupied than at school. So that 4 to 11 is where a lot of the worst stuff happens. At school, by and large, most schools, a few don't, have really pretty strict mobile policies anyway. They confiscate them. There's sometimes the embarrassment of a parent having to come and collect them from reception, which is embarrassing for a teenager, etc., etc. And I'm not saying children don't go into the toilet sometimes at break and do bad things, but actually in the school day, there's not a lot of time to be doing other things, which isn't to say there aren't the occasional very bad incident of someone being bullied at school. So everyone's putting the focus on banning in schools, and probably overall that's a good thing. The real thing is after school, and the real thing is social media for the under 16s, which is nothing to do with school or not. It just should be a ban because you shouldn't have addictive. It is an addiction, and so anyway, that's how I would look at it.
Vicky, can I come to you on this topic? Smartphone bans for young people.
It's so difficult, isn't it? Because on the whole, most schools, as you say, have very sensible policies around it. They manage it really well. I think it's that different from workplaces. I mean, I tell my team off when they come to meetings and one of them's on their phone, and I'm like, are we all in the room, or are we? So it's something we're all dealing with, isn't it? When should you have a phone, and when should you be using it, and when should you not? I suppose where I worry about it is much more about that abstinence message that inadvertently, I think, is pushing the problem much more towards the home. And the problem's already at home. It's already that 4 o'clock to 11 o'clock moment. So I think it's as much the messaging around it as the implementation of these bans that is problematic. And I think that's part of a much bigger problem that we're hearing from parents, we're hearing it from young people, we're hearing it from educators, that the narrative is so unrelentingly negative. The entire narrative that people have in their head about online life is that it's problematic, harmful, impossible to manage, needs to be restricted, needs to be banned. And back in the real world, that's absolute nonsense, because we can't achieve it. Even if you wanted to, you can't achieve it. So I think from that point of view, it's the talk of smartphone bans is the thing that I find really, really problematic, as opposed to well thought through, sensible restrictions on mobile phone use in schools.
Thank you. Any final words on this one, Julian?
Yeah, answer it as an individual rather than necessarily speaking for me. I don't support the idea of banning devices in school. I don't understand how you can do this work that the curriculum review wants to do if the thing which is going to be used every minute of every day for your media life is outlawed from the classroom. It makes no sense to me whatsoever. I also think it drives underground, as to pick up on Vicky's point, young people are already in quite chaotic lives who may be using a device because perhaps parents can't be where they should be, so the device is there for kind of safety and security, may be more vulnerable because then they, all kinds of reasons why I think if we want education to be for equality and for social justice, we need to make sure that young people have a safe space to work, I think, with devices, with skilled, pastorally minded teachers. It's a personal view. I also really don't understand how you're going to do AI in schools without phones. I mean, many people in this room have a lot of experience of working with teachers, and we know how many schools are poorly resourced, and we know that perhaps Wi-Fi doesn't work that well and technology is not that great. So I'm trying to imagine what a kind of critical engagement with AI in a classroom looks like if you can't use the device on which most people use AI. And on that, just I know you want to move forward, but I think I agree with your point about functional skills for AI being different to perhaps kind of critical engagement with AI. But I think education also needs to be about people having human agency to talk about the kind of AI we want. So rather than just using the AI we have and seeing the kind of the way that platforms and big tech are developing AI as something neutral, I think education is the place where we should be asking young people to help us imagine a better AI. I don't know how you do that either without phones in the classroom.
Excellent. I realise that I've been really pumping the questions on curriculum because you can see this is particular interest to me at the moment, but I really want to open it out to the audience. You may have questions not just about schools, you might be thinking about tech regulation, other kinds of public information infrastructure in our local communities, third spaces. Any questions from the room while you've been reflecting? We'll take them as a group of three, if that's okay. I'm going to start with Tiff at the front. please. Yes, everyone.
Alas. Hi, I'm Tiff. I'm the Chief Growth Officer at the Economist Educational Foundation and a newly minted trustee of Mila as well as of last week. My question is for Peter and Shuab. Thank you for writing something that was a pleasure to read after months of traipsing through, what was it, over 200 pages if we take CAR and the government response. I may have put that into AI to create a podcast to listen to on the way to work. But I really enjoyed reading it. And the panel's reaction to it was pulling out the complicated picture and the nuance, and that came through in your discussion too. I suppose my question is, if we're in this time of everything being taken as sound bites, snippets, sliced up, in the conversations you're having and your reactions to what you've written, are you seeing any pitfalls that people are falling into in a lack of nuance? And are there things that you would suggest we avoid in our interpretations of your research?
Thanks, Hannah. I just wondered, obviously, Hannah, you've mentioned that there was no resource attached to the curriculum and assessment review, and see people in the room will be familiar with that, with the RSHE guidance. I just, given that teachers are so overstretched and there's no resource to assist them on this, who do you think the best placed people are to deliver this? And there's no mention of working with experts, and I know they reference, I think, the Oak resources. Again, some concerns there. So yeah, just who can support on this, and are teachers the best placed people to be having these conversations?
Thank you. Two short questions. The evidence and media literacy programs show that they work best when they have a very singular and specific, clear goal and aim. So I think my first question for the panel is, what's the priority, and how would you trade off different skills and elements that we can teach young people? And the second was on measurement and evaluation. So the meta-analyses and systematic reviews show that media literacy programs are notorious in being actually able to draw meaningful inference from them from a measurement standpoint. So when it comes to measurement, evaluation, and learning, I'm curious what the panel think on, depending on the priorities, what actual metrics we can use to evaluate development of those skills, especially on a longitudinal basis, given the wearing off of effect sizes over time.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to come to Shuab and Peter on pitfalls to be watching out for. What advice would you have for the room?
Well, it's hard to legislate for nuance and force people to be nuanced. So you've just got to keep, I think, talking about the layers and the. So I think, as a point of almost sort of principle, and probably I would say this as a former teacher and head teacher, I think we've got to, and I think it's good for the country, you've got to treat, the moral panic goes in cycles. I was tracing back in the 50s and the 60s, there was been crazes, and there was, rave culture, and was seen as being, I found some quote about it being a sort of culture of evil and all of this sort of, so every generation has a complete panic from older generations about what young people are up to. And broadly, I think that's a very bad thing. So I think there's a stance going into this that actually give people the benefit of the doubt. Then that doesn't mean you gloss over harms that you want to deal with or education but I think that as a starting point gives you a perspective of more trust, which then gets you into nuance. So I think you start with that principle. Shall I just say a word on the who's best placed to do this? I think some of it's teacher training, but there's a reasonable budget. I mean, I say reasonable, there's not always a reasonable budget, but training goes on in schools. So I think partly this is a mindset. So I think there are pedagogies that you can, I mentioned philosophy for children, there are others that actually can get teachers relatively quickly. Some of the things we do at Voice 21 on oracy helps with this. So I think it is about the space and the training and having a robust pedagogy with scaffolding that then allows you in the classroom to facilitate these discussions in a way. And I think if that was done pretty wholesale, I think teachers would feel equipped to do it. I'm making it sound slightly easier than it is, but I think it is doable even with limited resources. But I think schools need to think that this is important. And there's a little bit of help on this in this new curriculum review, but you've got to strip back some of the unnecessary content, which has been sort of chock full. And actually, if you've got a bit less content, then you've got more time to go into depth and have proper discussion, which I think is the answer.
Lovely. Shep, did you want to come back on pitfalls or?
Yeah, just very quickly, the only pitfall that I've really seen, I think people have taken the nuance really well, is this is here how Keir Starmer can win young people in the next election. This is not about like winning a. You're not listening to win an election. You need to listen to have kind of like radical, meaningful listening. And we talk about the phrase radical listening, which Pete doesn't like, but yeah, you need to actually listen with an intent of trying to understand rather than having any other motive, because they can smell it out. But that'd be the only one. Yeah. And thank you for the repost on LinkedIn. I appreciate it.
When it comes to Vicky on who is best placed, I know that we could be thinking about teachers, but who else should be thinking about how we can deliver this change?
I think we should be thinking about teachers because they are best placed ultimately. So I don't think we should divert from that. Maybe to come at the question slightly differently, I can anticipate what will happen if there isn't proper funding for teacher training or time for teachers to be trained, is that I see two things happening. And one's kind of a weird thing for me to say because we do a lot of scale programs with organisations like YouTube and Google, and they're very good, I may say, and they're evidence-based, and they're developed by experts, and yada, yada, yada. But even I, who run those programs, would say, let's just be a little bit careful that what we don't do is open up the space for it to be exclusively populated by companies who are doing often very good education programs, but they don't do it for nothing. And so I think that's one really significant risk that I think we're going to see more of. And we see some brilliant programs, mostly ours, but we also see some rubbish. The other thing is the Oak Academy. And I do think it's really worrying and it's really confusing for parents if we're saying to them, be careful about screen time, be careful about digital tools, you need to get better at understanding AI, you need to help your kids navigate digital spaces, you need to think about giving permission and data and all of these different things. But actually what we're doing is digitising education. The Oak Academy is going to be providing all of these digital AI-generated lesson plans, low quality, I would argue. So we're going to get low quality, crappy lesson plans. Sorry, if anybody's here from the Oak Academy, you're very welcome to come and pour water over my head in a minute. You're going to get low quality, crappy lesson plans, and you're going to get corporate sponsored education programs. And that's why we need really good teacher training that's funded statutorily.
Yep.
I can't say that word, but you know what I mean.
Lovely. And Julian, do you want to speak to who is best placed, but also could you come on to the metrics question? I know we didn't get to talk about PISA, but...
So who's best placed is, I mean, I just agree, but also I don't know how to begin answering the question. If there's no money, then, call me old fashioned. But I think that, I mean, it needs to be, I mean, to make the serious point, it has to be funded if it's going to work, right? And there are many providers of good CPD for media literacy in the room, but you don't work for free, right? So there is a need, I think, to kind of push back against that kind of, we can't really accept that this can be done without any kind of resource whatsoever. On the metrics, so you'll know that the emerging PISA metrics are for media and AI literacy, male, and that might drive things, 'cause it tends to drive things in terms of indexes and league tables and everything else, which will obviously then complicate things in terms of the separation. There are ways of measuring and tracking the difference media literacy makes to people's lives. And, in my work at Bournemouth University, we developed a theory of change and recently finished a project where we mapped 400 media literacy interventions. Again, many of yours in the room to that theory of change. And what we do there is we break down access, awareness, capability, consequences, and that threshold of capability to consequences is where you want to look for the real meaningful impact media literacy has. But that's really difficult to do in education because what we tend to do well in education is raise awareness and capability. But if you think about other subject areas, there's no expectation that 10 years down the line, people who've done maths in school will change the world for the better, or, you know, save democracy, or whatever it might be, right? So I think that notion of kind of productive serenity and humility is to be able to say the metric should be what we can actually achieve in education, which is shifting people's awareness, critical thinking, and developing capabilities. But what they do with those capabilities, we perhaps unfortunately have to take a more neutral position about, because media literacy isn't necessarily kind of innately used for positive things.
I've got a particular view on funding that I'm just going to share just because I can.
Do you want to?
Oh yeah, let's take the mic. The fake mic. I found it very interesting that in the House of Lords inquiry into media literacy, the recommendation from that expert group was that we have a digital levy, that tech platforms contribute funds to the training of teachers and other costs of upgrading our media literacy skills, because there are places and people who have money in this ecosystem, and to me would make sense, and it made sense to the Lords Committee to be looking there. The government response to that was to say that we need a flexible ecosystem funding environment, and that there is money to be had. There has been a new task force set up, or a working group, a cross-government working group, to explore media literacy across many departments. So what we understand is that the money doesn't exist within DFE, but perhaps it could be that Minister Narayan explores other pots of money in other departments. So what we're hoping for is that we can find other money in other departments, or return to the idea of a digital levy. But that was just my 2 pence. Go on, Polly.
Can I just build on that? Something we're thinking about more broadly around the Epistemic Security Network work is that coming down the track, we've got this commitment to 5% spending on defence, and 1.5 percentage points of that is not military hardware, and it includes definitions around community and democratic resilience in there as well. So I think there's a lot to play for, and we'll be doing some work later this year to try and define what should be in that spending, because it's a huge amount of money. It will be very contested, because the Treasury will want to put as much as possible that's already being spent in that budget, and also because there'll be opposition at a NATO level against anything that looks woke. And so there's going to be a really big battle over how we define what we put into that budget. But I think our information security as a nation, in the broadest sense, with the broadest measures, is a really good case for us to be making as a network.
Excellent. Thank you. I can see a few hands up. I'm just going to look to the room. Okay, we'll go to Jono and Gia. I'll come back to you. I feel like Stefan from Mila should also get a shout, and I'll return to the other questions in a moment. But Jono, do you want to go first? We all get a go.
Thank you so much. Yeah, Jono from the PSHE Association. I just get on this point about funding and Vicky's point about effectively ceding control of the education narrative to tech companies who may or may not have other interests. There's a consultation, Ofcom have a consultation open at the moment on their statement of recommendations, which is a series of recommendations for platforms and streamers and anyone providing tech services, which I think its recommendation 7 is that they should actively support campaigns in media literacy, and they justify this on the grounds, well, there's no money and charities can't do it alone, which is absolutely true. But of course, it's a sort of open ticket for example, OpenAI to say, well, we're just doing what Ofcom said when we're trying to control the narrative about AI literacy. So yeah, just fill that out. It closes on the 6th of December, I think. And just while I've got the mic, question to Peter and Shob. I think one of the things, I absolutely take your point about not falling into the crisis, a moral panic. I think one of the things about moral panics in the past was it was very much a panic about naughty young people, up to no good, taking pills, fighting mods, all of those terrible things that youth used to do. Our panics now, I think, are very much about a kind of hopelessness for young people and a sense of crisis for young people, rather than a sense that they're up to no good, actually that they're unable to achieve kind of a quality of life. And you mentioned Kyla Scanlon, and one of the things she talks about is obviously this kind of crisis of futurelessness. And I wondered, this sense that you can't get on the housing market, you've got to worry about climate, global volatility. I wondered whether any of that came up, this sense that well, it's actually rational for me to just engage in short form content and meme stocks and, skin gambling, because ultimately what future is there? Now, your report comes across as really optimistic and complex. So I wondered, was there any of that kind of deep pessimism that comes out elsewhere?
I'm going to hold that thought and just come to in a minute, but Gia first, please.
Thank you. Already feeling nervous about this funny mic. Thank you all so much. This has been such a fantastic panel. I really appreciated, Julian, what you were saying about news literacy, also putting a lot of emphasis on the individual, and thinking of that in context with feeds being this mosaic of different information coming from different places, and making young people often really well informed, actually. I was thinking about, so we are the UK's only independent press regulator, and we have been thinking about this in the context of ensuring that there is trusted content out there and what that actually looks like. And so we've seen with our journalists that more than 2/3 of them actually don't have training on what is ethical content. And now we're actually working with Fran and the University of Liverpool and John Moores, trying to do some research to think about how can we ensure that creators, that the content they are creating and influencers is trusted, and that they actually understand their responsibilities to their audiences. So I'd love to have your take on how we can support that.
One more, and just very, very brief, if possible.
Thank you. Stefan, also from Mila, I'm afraid. I'm going to ask a slightly provocative question, and really perhaps speaking in a personal capacity. Peter, you said a few moments ago that you thought that overall the curriculum review was still wedded in the 1950s. I would say that's possibly charitable. If I was cynical, I'd say the 19th century. So the question is, how do you reconcile, in a sense, the imperative for information literacy and media literacy and the critical thinking that underpins it, with an education system which, perhaps to caricature it a little bit, is still essentially about the memorization and the regurgitation of knowledge in exam conditions in a very, very siloed way?
Okay, big picture education question. I felt like there was quite a lot there, probably for Peter and Shrove. Peter, do you want to come to your third?
Yeah, John, I would distinguish between moral panic. I don't call what you were saying moral panic. So there's moral panic about what are young people getting up to. I think your hopelessness thing is a different thing and really important. And all I would say, and part of our research where we take it next will be to get both a younger group, because they will be voting, the sort of 12, 13-year-olds will then be getting the vote in 3 years' time for 16, but also an older group when they've left. I think ours were probably slightly, our students are 16 to 18-year-olds, slightly artificially more optimistic for this reason, which is they haven't entered the real world yet. So schools generally are quite buoyant environments. Teachers are there to boost your confidence, to say, well, you're going to get to university or to apprenticeship, and they're spending all their time talking positively about their aspirations, and it's a sort of nice environment to do that. Of course, when you leave school or leave education and then can't buy a house, or living in with your parents age 30, or haven't got a proper job or whatever, then the evidence is you sort of fall off a cliff. So I think they were a bit more optimistic, and our job is to keep them optimistic. But that sort of hopelessness thing is a real issue. I think your question's right about. All I would say is we need to educate content creators on ethical behaviour. Of course, the worst ethical behaviour is the mainstream media, so they're not modelling it. So if you think about what's happening, not just with GB News, but where the Telegraph, Telegraph is a semi-fascist newspaper now. You know, it absolutely is. You know, if you read some of their opinion, it's absolutely vile. Now, Trump has partly given permission for people now to be airing things they never would have in the past, but it is absolutely horrible and worse than most of the sort of content creation. So we shouldn't think the new stuff is necessarily going to be worse. And you're completely right. I mean, you've defined it absolutely about the regurgitation of. So you need a foundational knowledge, and you need the sort of beauty of knowledge. So I am a believer that everyone needs to know the history of the country they live in. They need to know Shakespeare and all the rest of it. But you've got to do more than that. You've got to apply the knowledge. You've got to. I always think one change would make a huge difference. If you could take the internet into an exam, then you're not having to regurgitate knowledge. At that point, you've got to set proper exam questions that are about problem solving and thinking, and then you can. So it would change the very nature of what you're learning and then how it is assessed. With AI, it's going to be very different in its own right. One aside on AI, because we had a very thoughtful group of young people in one of the schools, in all the schools, but on AI, who was talking about. So those teachers amongst us will know the sort of science of learning that. We may know this. We may all know this anyway. But you remember things more if it's effortful, and also the process of learning is vital to learn how you make mistakes and correct them and whatever. So these young girls were very thoughtful about thinking that the problem with AI was the speed of it. That within a second you can sort of short circuit something that could take longer, but you would discover more things and learn more along the way. So again, there's something to bear in mind, or we need to be very mindful of the ubiquitous use of ChatGPT or whatever. It's going to stop the foundational underpinnings of learning.
Excellent. Always good to get a bit of memories, the rest of your thought in there.
Yes. Yeah.
Sorry, Becky. Did you want to come back on any of the 19th century curriculum, journalism, content creation?
Definitely not the 19th century curriculum. Definitely not Johnny's question about moral panics, but the question about influences, I think, is I blame Michael Gove. I draw a thread all the way back for so much, but that questioning the value of expertise, because this afternoon there was a TikTok event where one of the panels was a bunch of influencers talking about mental health, and it was followed by another panel that had a researcher on there. It had the CEO of Mind on there, and I was really struck by that kind of equal billing. And of course lived experience is important, and of course the enthusiastic amateur's always been a British hero, hasn't it? But you listen to it and you think, really, are we really giving equal weight to both of those voices without any kind of buyer beware message? So I just think something's gone really badly wrong in the information ecosystem where we make no distinction between the two, and it started with Mumsnet. Sorry, I don't mean that, but there you go.
There's no holds barred this evening. It's great. Julian, you want to come in on the 19th century?
Yeah, I mean, briefly, try and be brief about this. I mean, it's not. I think I agree with Stefan about the curriculum as a whole, but I think we should focus on the way literacy is schooled, and the way literacy is schooled is static when the research shows that it's dynamic. And what I mean by that is that we think of literacy in school as being it confers status in and of itself. It's autonomous. You have it or you don't. You can measure it. And we measure it in terms of, the skills and the ability to demonstrate one's literacy in that kind of static way. Whereas if you think about literacy from the kind of legacy of Paulo Freire, I can't roll my R's, but if I could, the Paulo Freire approach, where literacy is about a reflexivity around the conditions of your own existence. So the moment you become literate, it becomes political. And then if you think about the work of the new literacy studies in the UK, and if you think back to Richard Hoggart and the uses of literacy, then media literacy has an opportunity now to seize a moment, to be dynamic, negotiated, all of the things we've discussed, from the great research we've heard about before. And I actually think that takes us back to the positive we started with. The location of that in citizenship is really useful, because citizenship is an active, dynamic, situated, lived thing. And I think in that sense, there's potential, notwithstanding all the challenges that we've discussed.
Excellent. I'm conscious of time, and I know that there are a few questions left, but I want to make sure everyone's got time for networking before they get home for their dinner. So I may draw us to a close there, if that's okay. So where I may, I just want to make sure that there are no other final remarks that people are just, oh, if I only just had a time. Okay, excellent. So we can do come to ask our speakers further questions at the end. We do have wine and water, just to the side, there is some left, we can restock. But also just to say that we have been preparing a joint statement response to the government's response to the curriculum review, which you have on your seats. And when I say we, I mean a group of media and information literacy experts have been coordinated by Mila. At the moment, this joint statement is a work in progress. We would love feedback to strengthen the recommendations, but we would also love to circulate that with you with a view to gathering signatures and really highlighting the needs for how we can be strengthening whole society media literacy, but particularly through the curriculum. So do please have a look at that and send us your comments if you have more substantive comments to share with that. But just to say a huge thank you. What an excellent discussion. I'm very grateful to you all for being here, and please enjoy the water and wine and come and chat to us after.